If you want to use N8N better than 99% of people, you need to start seeing it differently. Because it's not about how many nodes you know or how many workflows you've built. The difference between the 1% and everyone else comes down to vision. Most people look at N8N as a bunch of disconnected features, triggers, and actions, and because of that mindset, every new workflow feels like starting over. The best builders see something completely different. They see 5 mechanics working together as one well-oiled machine. Once you see it that way, everything changes for you too. You stop figuring out N8N and start thinking with it. And in this video, I'm showing you those 5 core mechanics because the gap between you and the 1% isn't talent or experience, it's just seeing the tool the right way. If you look at this canvas and see a place to connect nodes, we're about to fix that. Because the top 1% see something else entirely. They see a system that moves data through time under very strict rules. That difference matters more than any node you'll ever learn. Because every workflow you build, no matter how complex it looks, is always doing the same few things. It starts, data enters, that data changes shape, decisions get made, and something comes out the other side. So let's look at what's actually happening. If I create a new workflow, the first thing N8N forces me to choose is a trigger. That's not just about when something runs. A trigger defines when this workflow exists. Until a trigger fires, there is no execution, no data, nothing moving at all. More importantly, the trigger defines the initial shape of your data. Whatever comes out of this trigger becomes the foundation everything else builds on. That's why experienced users obsess over triggers. They're not asking how this starts, they're asking what the data looks like at the very beginning. Once the trigger fires, the workflow moves forward into nodes. But nodes aren't actions. Every node does the same 3 things. It receives data, it changes that data in one specific way, and it outputs a new version of it. You can see that pattern clearly here. Input on the left, output on the right, and configuration in the middle. That middle section is where people think they're building logic, but what they're really doing is shaping data. If you don't know what your data looks like at each step, you're not building workflows. This is also why credentials matter more than most people think. Credentials aren't just some setup. They decide what the workflow can access in the outside world. Now, when you connect a trigger and a set of nodes together, you get what N8N calls a workflow. What actually matters in practice is how executions move through it. Executions aren't just runs. This is exactly where data hits your assumptions. And strong N8N users don't treat failures as errors. They treat them as mismatches. The data wasn't what they thought it was at that step, so the workflow behaved exactly the way it should have. That's why debugging isn't about rewriting node settings. It's all about scanning executions and asking one question over and over. Did the data look the way I expected? Once you build with that mindset, workflows stop feeling fragile. You fix assumptions upstream instead of patching things downstream. That one small change makes you build faster and feel more confident when something breaks. And once you stop treating things like experiments and start treating them as systems, what matters next is where they actually run. There are 3 main ways you can run N8N, but only one that will make your life easier and results better. The first option is N8N Cloud itself. The upside is obvious, it starts fast, there's nothing to install, and you can build workflows immediately in your browser. The downside is that you're always operating inside limits you don't control. Executions are capped, customization is restricted, and costs scale with usage. At first, the cloud version looks cheap. Once workflows do real work, it's almost always the most expensive option. It's fine for learning, but if you want to rely on N8N in your business or daily systems, cloud becomes a bottleneck. The second option is running N8N locally on your own machine. On paper, this sounds like the best of both worlds. Full control, no execution limits, and no cloud pricing. The problem here is reliability. The moment your laptop sleeps, restarts, or loses internet, your automations stop. Webhooks become unreliable, long-running workflows break, and you're responsible for every update and every issue. If something fails, you're the one fixing it. That's why local setups don't scale past experimentation. That's why serious N8N users self-host. Self-hosting puts N8N on an always-on server. Long workflows are safe. You're no longer designing around execution caps, uptime issues, or pricing tiers. You're designing around how your system should actually behave. Now, there are a lot of ways to self-host N8N. You can set up your own VPS manually, manage Docker yourself, and wire everything together from scratch. That all works, but it's complexity most people don't need. That's why I use Hostinger. They've already handled the hard parts. You get a VPS made for N8N, one-click setup, predictable pricing, and room to scale without redoing everything. Here's the setup at a high level. You open Hostinger using the link in the description and choose a VPS plan. For most people, KVM2 is the right starting point. It's got enough CPU and memory for real workflows, and you can scale up later if you need to. You select N8N as the application and finish the setup. You don't need to install Docker manually or configure anything complex. Once the server is ready, You open the dashboard and launch your N8N instance. At that point, you're looking at the same N8N editor you already know. The difference is that this instance is running on your own infrastructure instead of inside someone else's limits. From here on out, you build workflows exactly the same way, just with more freedom and fewer trade-offs. And once the environment is no longer the constraint, the thing that it actually determines how good your workflows are is how data moves through them. Without understanding data flow inside N8N, you end up wasting time on workflows that don't behave as expected. So let's look at this strictly through that lens. Everything here starts with a trigger. In this case, it's a scheduled trigger, but the timing doesn't matter. What matters most is that the trigger sets the starting shape of the data. That initial shape becomes the foundation for everything that follows. From there, we fetch data from an API. This is the first moment where meaningful data enters the workflow. Before this node runs, there's nothing to work with. After it runs, we now have structured input that every downstream node depends on. Next, N8N treats the response as a list of items. Each piece moves through the workflow independently. One execution, multiple data items. Now let's click into a node, because this is where most people get confused. Inside any node, three things are always happening. First, the node receives data from the previous step. Second, it changes that data in a specific way. Third, it outputs a result. That output becomes the input for the next node. If you look on the left side, you're seeing the input. This is exactly what the previous node passed in. On the right side, you're seeing the output, which is what this node produces after it runs. And in the middle is the configuration, where you decide how the node should behave. The middle section is where most of the real work happens. This is where you map fields. Mapping fields just means telling N8N, take this value from the input and use it here. You're not creating data out of thin air. You're taking existing data and deciding where it goes next. The edit field step makes this clear. It reshapes the data into a predictable structure. User ID, email, company, priority, score. This node isn't making decisions, it's making the data reliable. Under the hood, all of this data is represented as JSON. You don't need to be scared of that. JSON is just a structured way to describe information. Objects, arrays, fields. It's simply N8N being explicit about what the data looks like at this step. Once the data is shaped and stable, we route it. Routing doesn't change the data at all. It only decides where each item is allowed to go based on its current shape. In this workflow, high priority items go one way, medium priority items go another, and low priority items go a third way. Each item now continues forward on its own path. On the high priority path, we filter by score, sort the results, and limit them. Notice what's happening here. We're not adding anything, just narrowing the data down. On the medium priority path, we clean up the data to make it easier to use later. On the low priority path, we apply custom processing. The specifics don't matter here. What matters is that the same rule still applies. Input comes in, data changes shape, output moves forward. At this point, the data is routed into separate outputs. In a full workflow, you'd process each path and then merge them back together. From there, the data exits the workflow and gets sent somewhere useful. That's the full data flow. Data enters through a trigger, it gets shaped, routed, and processed, and then it comes back together before it exits. When something breaks, you can see where the data stopped lining up. And once you can answer that, you can fix almost anything. So how do you decide what happens when the data doesn't line up or when a condition fails? If you don't account for that, your automations won't run reliably for long. So for this section, I built a very simple demo workflow. I'm starting with a manual trigger, just to get the data moving. The trigger itself doesn't matter, and what really matters is what happens once the data gets into the workflow. Right after that, I create some sample data. Each item has a priority and a few basic properties. The specifics don't matter here. What matters is that we now have data flowing, and we need to decide how it's allowed to move forward. The first control step is a filter. This node doesn't change the data at all. It simply decides which items are allowed to continue and which ones are dropped. Only active items move forward. Everything else stops here. This is how control logic works in N8N. It doesn't transform data, it controls whether data is allowed to continue. Next, we route by priority. This is similar to what we saw earlier, but now it's being used for decision making instead of organization. Each item gets evaluated and sent down a different path based on priority. Each priority path processes the data slightly differently. Not because the workflow is complicated, but because different situations require different handling. This is where workflows stop being linear and start behaving like systems. After that, the data comes back together. Merging doesn't undo decisions, it just reunites the data streams. What happens on each path is reflected in the data from that point on. From here, we add another control layer. We check if a value crosses a threshold. If the condition is true, the data goes one way. If it's false, it goes another. This is classic if-else logic. Again, no data is being created here. We're just enforcing rules. After that, we process items individually, and finally, we apply some custom logic. This step is just here to show that control logic doesn't stop at built-in nodes. When something needs to be more specific, you can always drop down into code. And that's the core idea behind control logic. You're not teaching N8N how to think. You're giving it clear rules about when data is allowed to move forward, when it should take a different path, and when it should stop entirely. Once you understand that, you start seeing the full picture, how workflows start, how data moves, and how decisions get made. The final piece is making those decisions smarter. And we do that by incorporating AI in a smart way. What I mean by that is simple, is that AI is best at handling the messy parts, the things rigid rules struggle with. But the most important thing to understand is that AI is not special. Inside N8N is just another node in the workflow. So let's use the data flow workflow as the example. Right here, after we've already merged all the branches and calculated the statistics, I've added an AI data analyst node. That placement is deliberate. At this point, the data is already clean, structured, and meaningful. We're not asking AI to fix chaos. We're asking it to interpret results we've already organized. By placing the AI node here, it does three very specific things. First, it looks at the aggregated data. Second, it interprets patterns and summaries that would normally require a human to review. Third, it produces structured insights that are ready to use downstream. Nothing before this changes. The routing, filtering, merging, all of that still happens exactly the same way. Now let's look at the AI node, because this is where things usually get overcomplicated. The AI node consists of 4 key parts. First, the chat model. This is where you pick the model. Here, we're using GPT-4. That's it. Second, memory. For this workflow, we don't need memory at all. Memory is only important when you need long-running context. This workflow is stateless, so we leave it out. Third, tools. Tools are optional, but conceptually important. When you give an AI node tools, you're not letting it do whatever it wants. You're giving it specific capabilities it's allowed to use. In this case, the AI already has everything it needs, so no tools are required. And finally, the output parser. This is one of the most important pieces. The output parser forces the AI to return data in a predictable structure instead of free-form text. That lets the output move safely to the next node, be saved in Google Sheets or sent to Slack without breaking the workflow. What's actually happening? The AI node receives the aggregated results as input. It interprets them based on the instructions we gave it, and it outputs structured insights as new fields on the data. From N8N's perspective, this is no different than any other node. Data goes in, data comes out. The difference is that rules can only handle what you explicitly define. AI handles judgment, summarization, and prioritization, all within guardrails you control. Now you see N8N the way it's actually supposed to be seen. This is 5 mechanics working together through the same lens the top 1% have always used. That AI node only works if the workflow is always running. If it shuts down when your laptop closes, or charges you every time it fires, it falls apart pretty quickly, which is exactly why self-hosting on Hostinger makes all of this actually possible. If you want to build automations without limits getting in the way, sign up to Hostinger using the first link below.